Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're heading way back, really far back, to the early medieval period, 732 AD to be specific. We're going to be looking closely at a single battle, one that gets mentioned all the time as, well, basically the moment that saved European Christendom, the Battle of Tours, or sometimes you hear it called the Battle of Poitiers. Now, the sources we've gathered for this week, a mix of old chronicles and modern analysis, they all seem to agree this battle was foundational for Western history. But our mission here is to dig a bit deeper, right? Is this really the huge turning point everyone claims? Or has the story maybe gotten bigger over the centuries, for political reasons? Okay, let's get into it.
Yeah, the stakes were incredibly high, no question about it. You got this massive clash happening. On one side, the Franks and their allies from Aquitaine, led by Charles Martel, who, remember, was Charlemagne's grandfather. And on the other side, the Umayyad Muslim forces. They were expanding rapidly, coming up from Al-Andalus, Spain, crossing the Pyrenees. They had already conquered the Visigoths in Iberia and were pushing deep into what's now France under their governor, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi. The standard story, the one you usually hear, is pretty simple. The Franks won, stopped the Muslims from going further north, and, well, that locked in Europe's identity.
And the immediate results, they look pretty dramatic. Christianity stays dominant in that whole region. And maybe just as importantly, Charles Martel himself gets this huge boost in power. He was technically just the mayor of the palace, but this win, it basically made him the man. It really laid the groundwork for his family, the Carolingians, and eventually Charlemagne's empire.
Absolutely. It's more than just a battle. It's kind of the launch pad for a whole dynasty. But before we get too carried away with the consequences, we need to look at the basics, the evidence. And that's where things get tricky. We know the battle happened in western France, sometime in October 732, somewhere between the cities of Tours and Poitiers. But what's really fascinating, and maybe a bit frustrating, is that for such a supposedly world-changing event, we still don't know the exact spot.
That seems crazy. How can something so pivotal just vanish from the map? Why is it so hard to find?
Well, it's a classic problem with medieval history, isn't it? The contemporary accounts we have are just vague on locations. They weren't drawing maps like we do. Plus, nobody put up a big monument right after saying, here it is. Yeah. Had centuries of farming, landscape changes, the lack of, major archaeological digs focused just on this. The exact site just kind of fades away.
Okay, so if we can't even be sure where they fought, how much trust can we put in the other details, like the strategy, who had more soldiers, how many died? It almost sounds like we're building this massive historical moment on, legends.
That's not too far off, honestly. We have to tackle the source problem directly. The accounts we rely on, they're few and they're biased, mostly written by Christian chroniclers, and often written years, maybe even decades after the battle. Think about the continuations of the Chronicle of Fredegar. These writers weren't neutral reporters. They had agendas. They wanted to make the Franks look heroic, the defenders of Christendom, right? And they wanted to boost the legitimacy of Charles Martel and his rising family. So what does that lead to? Exaggeration, making the enemy seem bigger, scarier, inflating the victory, downplaying their own losses. Historians today, we have to treat these sources very, very carefully, cross-reference everything.
Right, it's like you're constantly reading between the lines, trying to filter out the propaganda. So given that skepticism, let's dive into the part that seems the most inflated. The numbers, the army size, the casualties. This is where it gets really interesting.
Oh, definitely. The numbers are probably the clearest sign of, let's call it, historical amplification. Modern historians looking at logistics, what was actually possible back then, comparing with other campaigns, they paint a much different picture. So for the Franks, we're probably looking at something like 15,000 to 30,000 soldiers, a very respectable army for the time. And the Umayyad army, well, forget those wild numbers like 400,000 you sometimes see in older texts. Modern thinking puts them much closer to the Franks, maybe around 20,000 to 30,000 as well. Roughly equal forces.
Whoa, hang on. 400,000? I mean, even hearing that number now sounds unbelievable for the 8th century. Why are modern historians so sure that's impossible?
Logistics, plain and simple. Think about feeding an army that size. Watering the horses, thousands and thousands of horses, they're deep in enemy territory. Their supply lines back to Spain would be stretched incredibly thin. An army of 400,000 would have eaten the entire region bare in days. It would have been impossible to command effectively, especially back then. Those huge figures, like some sources claiming 375,000 Umayyad dead. Almost certainly just borrowing numbers from other stories, maybe biblical battles or just pure invention to make the victory seem divinely ordained. It's literary, not literal.
Okay, so that changes everything. It wasn't David versus Goliath. It was more like two heavyweights slugging it out. A big, well-led Frankish army against another big, maybe slightly overextended Umayyad army, much closer to a fair fight. But even then, if the numbers were roughly even, the Franks were mostly infantry, right? Not the heavy knights we picture later on. And the Umayyads were famous for their cavalry, fast and deadly. So how did Martel pull off the win against an enemy known for speed and mobility?
Now that's where Martel's real genius comes in. And it's why the battle is still seen as tactically significant, even if we adjust the numbers. He didn't try to outmaneuver the Umayyad cavalry. No, he basically built a wall to stop them cold. He went for an incredibly strong defensive strategy. He used his infantry, which was heavily armed, well armored for the time, and formed them into a dense square or phalanx-like formation. He wasn't aiming for a quick strike. He was preparing to absorb the shock.
Can you paint a picture of that? What did that formation actually look like on the field?
Okay, imagine thousands of soldiers packed tightly together, shoulder to shoulder, long spears bristling outwards, a solid block of infantry. The idea was to be unbreakable, to withstand those repeated charges from the Umayyad horsemen without the line buckling or breaking apart.
That sounds tough and impressive, especially since those tactics had apparently worked well for the Umayyads against the Visigoths further south. Why did this Frankish shield hold firm?
Several things. Discipline, first off. These Frankish soldiers were veterans, loyal to Martel. Armor helped. But crucially, Martel picked his ground carefully. He seems to have chosen a higher position, possibly with woods nearby. This limited the space the cavalry had to charge effectively, protected his flanks, and maybe channeled the attack towards his strongest point. He basically forced them into a killing zone where their mobility was less of an advantage. Some accounts, they talk about the Franks standing like a wall of ice, just unmoving. The Frankish cavalry, they were mostly held in reserve, protecting the sides and the camp. The infantry square was the star of the show.
And Martel wasn't just rigid, right? There's that story about the Umayyad attempt to raid the Frankish camp behind the lines.
Exactly. That shows his flexibility. Some Umayyad riders did break off, trying to hit the baggage train, a classic tactic to cause panic and draw defenders away. But Martel anticipated this, or reacted quickly. He had reserves ready to counter that specific threat to protect his camp. And here's the turning point. When some of the Umayyad cavalry saw their own loot potentially threatened, or maybe just saw the raid on the camp happening, they started peeling off from the main fight to go protect it. This caused confusion, possibly looked like a retreat. And it seems that in that chaos, their leader, Abdul Rahman, was killed. And that was catastrophic for Umayyad morale. Their commander down, confusion in the ranks. The attack just fell apart after that.
So the win came from defensive strength, smart positioning, and then exploiting a moment of chaos and broken morale on the enemy side, triggered by their leader's death. Not some big heroic charge.
Pretty much. Defensive endurance followed by capitalizing on a critical enemy blunder. So if we zoom out now, connect that tactical victory to the bigger historical picture. What did Tours actually change in the long run? Besides making Martel a hero, well, its biggest impact was setting a limit. It effectively halted major organized Umayyad expansion north of the Pyrenees. Yes, there were still raids later on, but the idea of incorporating Gaul into Al-Andalus, that was basically off the table after 732. The Umayyad focus shifted. They turned inwards, towards consolidating their vast territories in Iberia.
Which, politically for the rest of Europe, was huge. Martel's wins stabilized the Frankish kingdom, gave it breathing room, and that stability is what let his successors, Pepin and then Charlemagne, build the Carolingian Empire that would define early medieval Europe. It gave Christian Europe a solid political and military core.
And it wasn't just politics. It became deeply cultural, deeply religious in its telling. Tours got written up by the chroniclers as the decisive clash. The moment Christian Europe held the line against Islamic expansion, it really helped solidify that idea of a clear boundary, a kind of us versus them between Christendom and the Islamic world. That narrative, built partly on Tours, had echoes for centuries, right up to things like the Crusades.
It built a kind of conceptual wall in the north, but history's messy, isn't it? Because that same shift, that Umayyad refocusing south into Iberia, had a completely different, almost opposite effect down there.
That's the really fascinating counterpoint. Because they stopped pushing north, the Umayyads invested heavily in consolidating Al-Andalus. And this, maybe ironically, led to this incredible period of, well, relative coexistence in Spain. It's often called convivencia.
Right, coexistence. What did that actually mean for people living in Iberia then?
Well, for several centuries, you had Muslims, Christians, and Jews living together, often in the same cities. There was a remarkable exchange of ideas, science, philosophy, medicine, art. Cordoba became this incredibly vibrant center of learning, while much of northern Europe was, frankly, less developed. So the consolidation of Umayyad power after Tours in Iberia actually fostered one of the most dynamic and culturally rich societies of the Middle Ages. A direct, though probably unintended, result of the northern expansion being stopped.
Wow. So pulling it all together, what's the main takeaway here? The Battle of Tours maybe it wasn't about wildly inflated numbers or a tiny band of heroes against a million invaders. It seems it was more about Charles Martel's smart defensive tactics that worked brilliantly on the day. And that victory created a crucial border, politically and culturally, in 8th century Europe. It sent Europe down two paths, really. Christian consolidation in the north, and this complex, blended society in the south, in Spain.
Exactly. The battle itself created a kind of dividing line that shaped medieval Europe and, the whole future trajectory of Western Christendom for a very long time. We should probably remember it less for the myths and more for that strategic impact, the border it helped define.
Okay, so here's something to think about, our final thought for you. We know the accounts are biased, that they massively inflated the threat to make Martel look better. So, if the foundation of this pivotal moment rests so heavily on politically motivated hype, does that mean Charles Martel's real genius wasn't just military, but also public relations? Was his greatest victory convincing everyone he'd saved the world, perhaps from a threat that wasn't quite as overwhelming as the storytellers claimed? We'll let you chew on that, how much a history is just a really good story, told by the winners.